If you've ever heard someone say, "But what about black on black crime?" we've got you covered. Scrolling through your Facebook feed, you'll probably see articles and arguments about Black Lives Matter. A lot of people are mad or just confused about this movement. So here are responses to 4 questions you might hear when talking about Black Lives Matter. Oh, so you care about Black lives? Then why aren't you talking about black on black crime? First off, this assumes that the Black community isn't worried about gun violence, which isn't true. For example, Ceasefire in Chicago is an organization that actually intervenes in local street and gang fights. There's even a documentary about them called The Interrupters.
That's nice, but the subject is what the Black Lives Matter movement protests about, not the Black community in general.
Black Lives Matter isn't just about the loss of life, which is always terrible. It's about the lack of consequences when Black lives are taken at the hands of the police.
If that were so, this movement would not have been birthed when a private citizen, George Zimmerman, not a police officer, killed a black teen, Trayvon Martin.
When a civilian has committed a violent crime, they're generally arrested, tried, and then convicted. Conversely, there's a lot of evidence that it's very rare to secure an indictment against a police officer for excessive force. And an indictment is just a trial. It's not even a conviction.
Very true, but that is an issue with all communities, not just the black community. If that is the issue, then a hashtag like Civilians Lives Matter would suffice.
Also, black on black crime isn't a thing. 84% of white murder victims were killed by another white person. But we don't call it white on white crime. That's because our communities are still very segregated. So if you have the misfortune of being the victim of a crime, the perpetrator will most likely look like you.
That is actually incorrect. 82.76% of the white homicides are committed by whites. But that includes justified killings by police or private citizens, so they are not classified as murders. But don't forget, even though Latinos are predominantly mestizos with native and or African ancestry, the FBI still classifies them as white, so the numbers are misleading because we don't know how many whites are Hispanic. On the same token, 91.79% of black homicides are committed by blacks, but that also includes justified killings by police or private citizens, so they are not classified as murders.
So why do people always bring up black on black crime? Because it's a diversion. They're trying to prove black citizens don't have the right to be outraged about police violence because their communities have a crime problem. But the truth is, black people are not more violent or more likely to commit crimes than anyone else.
It is not a diversion. While the majority of blacks aren't killing anyone, the minority that commits black on black homicides does it at a rate 6 times higher than whites who commit white homicides. In fact, 50% of the violent crime in the nation comes from black criminals. That means 50% of the violent crime in the nation is predominantly concentrated in a region where 13% of the US population lives, with the other 50% distributed across the region 87% of the population lives. That means the people at highest risk are the black communities, and that is where the most police concentration will occur. Police presence does help deter violent crime, but it is a patch, not a solution, and there is the risk of committing errors or even abuse. But this isn't exclusive to black communities. Protesting legitimate police abuse should always be encouraged, and some of the cases Black Lives Matter espoused were valid, but others were just crying wolf where no police impropriety or racism existed. There are very valid concerns that some of the police training only allows for a lethal center mass shot. This has cost many people their lives, not just blacks, because a movement that might have spooked the officer and he shot center mass, or even when a knife or another less lethal white arm was drawn. There has to be a better training for the police. I know they just want to make it safe to their families as well, but center mass shooting has cost way too many lives when the officers mistake a movement or object for a weapon. Another legitimate concern is that police overexposure to high levels of crime can lead to implicit bias. Some officers may be racist, but others just develop implicit biases the community already has as well. Members of the African American community are not immune to it, as it is a basic psychological mechanism. In shoot-don't-shoot scenarios, African American civilians fared worse than officers in shooting unarmed African Americans. One study even indicates that African American officers shoot African American civilians at a higher rate than their white counterparts. This is not internalized racism, but exposure to the same cues over a long period of time will create neural pathways or shortcuts for subconscious split-second decisions. So implicit bias is a risk, and other than rotating cops and a heavier community presence, I don't know of a solution, but any new officer you bring in will face this risk over time, regardless of his ancestry or upbringing. Hopefully studies will figure out what is needed. Having said that, there are legitimate criminals out there that need to be stopped, and Black Lives Matter racializes every police black encounter, regardless of the evidence. Crying wolf and playing the race card only causes people to ignore when you have a legitimate claim out there. And ignoring when similar events occur in other communities and acting like this is only happening to black communities only alienates those who could support you in making changes to police procedure.
The reality is, because of a history of institutional racism, black communities have higher poverty rates, suffer from poorly funded schools, and are more likely to be targeted by police.
Sure, Jim Crow was horrible, and it did leave a good chunk of the African American community in shambles. But its biggest damage was using the government, law and order, education, and the medical profession as suppression tools against them. It has created memes of distrust against the very institutions that now seek to correct the wrongs of the past. New populations are migrating here, both native and Afro descent, and though much more impoverished than African Americans, they are taking much better advantage of their resources. It is no accident that the biggest recipients of affirmative action in higher education are not African Americans, but Africans, Afro-Caribbeans, and Afro-Latinos. Two currents of thought arose from Jim Crow: those who were successful in establishing strong work ethics and patterns that have established multi-generational African American success stories, and there are those who are still caught in the cyclical despair that Jim Crow weaved, unable to break the vicious cycle of inherited poverty and distrust in the tools that might uplift them. There is still much that has to be done to uplift these communities in poverty, but the playing of the blame game, victimism, and race cardism is not helping the community. Crying over slavery or Jim Crow or claiming all these encounters are cop racism won't solve problems of uplifting the community or stopping the daily killing. Radical acceptance is needed. Look it up. You have to accept what was and then try to figure out what can be done to fix it. Not crying white supremacy, not seeking white guilt, but what concrete things need to be done to uplift the community, its infrastructure, etc. And hopefully this next generation will see more of the African American diaspora in higher education.
So are you saying blue lives don't matter? Of course the lives of cops matter. That's why if you kill a police officer, you are rightly arrested and prosecuted.
Just like those who are innocent victims of police brutality, like Eric Garner, Renisha McBride, Oscar Grant, among others, prosecution doesn't mean anything if you're already dead. But there's no evidence that these deaths were caused by racism, just terrible cops. Demonizing the entire spectrum of officers who risk their lives to protect yours only creates further memes of the evil government and desire to lash out, as evinced by the killing of innocent police officers.
But saying blue lives matter effectively lumps a profession into the same category as a marginalized group of people. Becoming a police officer is an occupation, it's a choice. It's not something you're born into.
Self-marginalizing at this point. And those officers chose a profession to serve the community, the very community that's demonizing them and putting their lives at risk, many of whom come from those same marginalized communities.
And most importantly, advocating for citizens is not anti-cop. The job of police officers is to protect and serve all communities. If that's not happening, we need to reassess and find a solution.
Cop blaming en masse for the possible mistakes of a few and the proper procedure of many, while playing the race card, is not advocating for a solution.
So you're saying only Black Lives Matter? That's racist. We've talked about this before, but this movement is not saying Black Lives Matter more than anyone else's. It's saying Black lives should matter, but the way that our justice system, our media, and our police have been operating suggests that they do not.
Not true at all. The police job is to protect. It is the job of the local government to find a solution to the poverty and create incentives for improvement. Officers patrol to stop crime, and when crime is high, they have to make many split-second decisions. Sometimes they are wrong, but this isn't something exclusive to black communities, as we see tragedies occurring all over the country with similar fact patterns to the ones paraded by Black Lives Matter.
It's totally okay for a movement to focus on issues specific to one marginalized group. Gay bars aren't unfair to straight people. A breast cancer walk isn't unfair to other forms of cancer, and Save the Rainforest isn't saying you hate all other trees.
PETA also advocates for a cause, but through the acts of civil disorder and even acts that could be considered domestic terrorism. Advocating for a cause doesn't mean you get to demonize the innocent. In this sense, Black Lives Matter has been even worse than PETA. I may be an animal lover, but I will never support PETA's tactics, and I believe in improving our communities, but will never support the fraudulent and harassing tactics of Black Lives Matter.
To quote one law professor's letter, the subtext of Black Lives Matter is, because of the brutalizing and killing of black people at the hands of the police, and the indifference of society in general, and the criminal justice system in particular, it is important that we say, Black Lives Matter.
As there is no evidence of any specific targeting of black communities for brutalizing, they only matter in the context that police procedures should be improved and bad cops should be held accountable in all communities. All lives matter. A hashtag that existed way before Black Lives Matter and was even used by African Americans.
But what about the white victims of police violence? There's way more of them. Yes, there are more white people killed by police officers than black people. But when you look proportionately within the populations, black Americans are 2.5 times as likely as white Americans to be shot and killed by police officers.
Which is not distributed across the country equally. The highest chances of getting shot are in communities with high crime rates. And even then, considering those concentrated areas of high volume of violent crime where black men face daily risks of getting shot, such as the national average for black men is 6 times higher than that of white men. That the risk of getting shot by a police officer in these same areas is 2.5 times higher than white people overall is not surprising at all. If anything, it's below what would be expected. What you should be asking is, what is the risk for white people in similar neighborhoods and their levels of crime, etc.? Or that of Native Americans, who die at a higher rate than African Americans, yet have lower violent crime rates. A national average doesn't mean much if you don't understand what is occurring locally.
Black men make up just 6% of the nation's population, but of all the unarmed people shot and killed by police in 2015, 40% of them were black men. Those numbers are tragic.
And while only an infinitesimal part of the 6% are violent crimes, most between the age of 18 and 24, they are committing 50% of the violent crimes in this country, exposing their fellow generation to crossfire and increased police interaction. There is a reason. This is the only age group that is outpacing all other people in death by cop. The other generations of African Americans are lower than Native Americans, and so are the Africans and other Afro-diasporas.
If an unarmed citizen is killed by the police, or an armed citizen is killed under suspicious circumstances, people should be upset no matter what the victim's race. This isn't a competition.
When an unarmed or even armed person dies in suspicious circumstances, we seek evidence. We canvass for witnesses. We seek the truth. We don't jump to conclusions on any side and start social media for protesting or attempting to harass families of alleged perps. There's something called innocent till proven guilty. There are 2 sides to a story and both should be heard. I am not for police secrecy, but neither am I for media lynching.
Sadly, police violence is a problem in many communities, but bringing up other victims to discredit the Black Lives Matter movement is pretty disingenuous.
No, it's not. Black Lives Matter consistently claims this is only happening to them and that it is racism because they are black. Showing that it happens to other people shows racism is just an assumption. As for being affected disproportionately, until crime is lowered in these communities with sound policies, a strong police presence will be needed, or the deaths by black criminals will be much higher than they are now, including the deaths by some bad cops.
If you really believe that police violence is a problem, you should support Black Lives Matter, as well as other organizations fighting for victims and their families.
I don't support racialized movements that threaten family members like that of the Bells or the Zimmermans and others through media persecution instead of seeking a proper day in court. I do support organizations that seek police procedure reform though, as well as getting rid of bad cops when they are proven to be guilty.
I know these conversations are hard, but they're necessary if we want to move forward. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time right here on Decoded.